Hi everyone. First off, shout out to my boy Zach. Your channel really inspired me to give superhero comic books one more chance. I'd taken about a 10-year break from Marvel and DC comics. I hadn't checked out entirely. I was still reading older comics, but I was done buying new comics. And during that time, I kind of read manga a bit, kind of read a lot of Will Eisner, but I was done with superhero comics. You convinced me to give it another shot, and you are indirectly the result of me making this video, because while I was at the comic book shop, saw this manga, picked it up immediately because I've seen their first 10 volumes and I loved all of them, and I was excited for this. While I was reading this, at first I was thinking about the comic, the pros of the comic, the cons of the comic. Would I recommend it? Yes, I would. Would I recommend it to someone who is not a fan of the Legend of Zelda franchise? I think I still would, pretty strongly, because I think they do an effective job. This Akira Himakawa, by the way, is not one person. It is two ladies who work at collaboratively, one writer, one artist, and this is their pen name, which they both use, which I think is really sweet. So as I was reading this, at first I was thinking about the pros and cons of the comic, which is something I love to do. When I'm reading these things, I think about how would I do it differently if I'm not liking something. If I am liking something, how can I use that in my own work when I make comics or when I'm doing illustration work? But as I kept thinking, my train of thought started going in strange directions. I started thinking about video games. I started thinking about comic books in general, social justice, feminism, Gamergate. And I thought about Feminist Frequency and their video on damsels in distress, and The Legend of Zelda, I think, was featured in that. I know they talked about Mario, and I think Zelda was mentioned as her second major example. But then I stepped back and I said, wait a second, how come reading this one manga lead me to thinking about all of these essentially philosophical issues? What do all these debates have to do with the comic I just read? And as I thought about that, something clicked for me. I've been thinking about the arts and politics, philosophy, religion, and art for about 6 years because I'm interested in how they're related to one another. In one way, it's really obvious how they're related to one another. The arts can function as propaganda for a worldview. So if you're the Catholic Church during the 1500s, you can use painting to communicate to the people Catholic values. If you're Martin Luther during the age of the Reformation, you can use the printing press to distribute illustrations condemning the Catholic Church. There's a really obvious way in which the arts relate to politics and philosophy. Politicians and politics, philosophy, these all influence artists and the kind of work they want to make. If you think that Greek standards of beauty are problematic and patriarchal, you're not going to make Greek statues probably. And artists influence the world around them. You tell stories, you affect how people think, how they see the world, how they think of good and evil. So the artists affect the young minds that become politicians and philosophers and scientists, and the rest of the world influences the artists because they look at the world and they draw from the world and they put that in their art. But at the same time, there's also a general feeling that the art should be separate from the cares of the political world. If you want to read a comic, it's because you want to escape from hearing about the latest Trump policy and controversy surrounding that. You want to watch a football game. You want to read a superhero comic. You want to watch a fun, goofy show on Netflix. It's supposed to be escape from the cares and the troubles of life. So there are two streams of thought. One is that the arts are kind of the servant of justice, of some philosophical idea of what's moral, and the other that the arts are separate from this world, that you want to keep politics out of your art as much as possible. So how did this prompt me to think about this problem? Because it's semi-related to this series, but it really is a bigger question the thing I'm talking about is bigger than whether you like or dislike the video game franchise this manga is based on. It's a question that gets to the entire history of art and the entire history of philosophy. What's the purpose of art in relation to how we discuss these things? So the first brainstorm I had, I think I should talk about the comic first to help me focus, and then I'll move on to the bigger idea after that. So I'll just start by talking about the comic a bit. I'll save talking about the art and the story for another video, but the first brainstorm I had was I realized that The Legend of Zelda, at its heart, is a romantic story about knights in shining armor rescuing fair maidens in distress that he cares about. And this is the Ivanhoe story. Now, if you haven't read Ivanhoe and you love superheroes, if you love Pirates of the Caribbean, romance, adventure, I'd highly recommend Ivanhoe. I haven't read Ivanhoe since I was about 12 years old, so this is a little hazy, but I do have very strong memories of how Ivanhoe affected my imagination, even when I was too young to understand some of the politics of it. You know, it touches on anti-Semitism, it touches on duty and tensions between warring political groups. So there's a sense in which it is a mature novel, grappling with mature themes and important themes, but it's also a very important romantic story about chivalry, about knights in shining armor, about fighting for the ones you love, about doing what's right. And at its heart, I think Ivanhoe has had a similar effect on sword and sorcery kind of storytellers that John Carter of Mars has had on science fiction stories. It was a genre maker for centuries to come. And when I think about the Zelda franchise, what I've come to realize is this is the popular Ivanhoe story of the 21st century. You want to read a story about a young, handsome man who comes of age and saves a princess? Well, that's Star Wars, but if you like knights in shining armor, that's Legend of Zelda. And I'm sure you could think of many, many examples of other fine stories like that, maybe even a better quality than this one. But this is at least the most popular retelling of this story. When I was very young, I used to think of Zelda as a fantasy in the lines of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I kind of thought of it, well, he's got pointy ears like an elf. There are macablins that are like Tolkien's goblins. There are gorgons that are kind of like big muscular dwarves living in the mountains. And so I thought of it as Tolkien or Game of Thrones minus the complex history and the complex language. So it's like Game of Thrones or J.R.R. Tolkien for little babies. But then when I made the Ivanhoe connection, something clicked, and I understood why this continues to have such resonance for me, even as I've grown older, is that it's the telling of a beautiful story in an age where that story itself is seen as problematic. The Ivanhoe story is a young man should work to become stronger and be able to do violence if necessary, but only to protect someone that they care about. That could be a romantic interest. It could be a princess. It could be a maiden fair. It could be a father or a mother or a brother or a sister. It could be just an innocent person where you know that their life is being threatened, and you know the right thing to do is to intervene and protect their life. That's the core moral of Ivanhoe. That's what it teaches. Now, how does feminism enter into this? Well, if you've seen the Anita Sarkeesian feminist frequency video on damsels in distress, I'd highly recommend that, because that's what I'm thinking of as the example of popular feminism talking about this. Obviously, feminists were thinking about this decades before Anita Sarkeesian was a household name. But let me try to summarize fairly the feminist argument for why this might be seen as problematic. Essentially, the argument is that stories about young men heroically going on quests to save young women is that this is a fairy tale which reinforces patriarchal values. And the idea of patriarchy is that it's this powerful system created by men for the benefit of men at, at the expense of women. And within intersectional feminism, then you also have the idea that not only is it about men, but the patriarchy is also racist. It favors white men. The patriarchy is heteronormative. It favors heterosexual men. The patriarchy is cisnormative. It favors people who are cisgendered or identify as the biological gender they were born as. So it quickly goes from patriarchy to white, cis heteronormative, sometimes Christian patriarchy. That's what's viewed as the hyper perfection of all privilege. If you are all of those things, all the ideas, all of society, all of its institutions are built to benefit you, and they do benefit you in a concrete, material way that you can never see. Even if you check your privilege, you'll never be able to see all the ways it benefits you. And the only people who can see it are people who are not part of the white, cis heteronormative Christian patriarchy. So then what's the problem with a story like this? Well, the problem with a story like this is that this isn't really a story about a young man who cares about a young lady and he's trying to protect her. This is a story about a man who sees women as property. And it's a story about a woman who is supine and doesn't take charge of her destiny, but she just sits and waits around for a man to come save her. Now, I don't want to come off as someone who just wants to attack SJWs all day or something, because I have a lot of sympathy for people who advocate for social justice. I have a lot of sympathy for feminists. These were my classmates. These were people who I cared about and who I was friends with, but I never really bought the argument, even though I could see there was something compelling about the argument. The compelling idea about the argument is, I don't think anyone wants to raise a daughter or spend their entire life with someone who fits the stereotype of the supine princess. She doesn't do anything to help herself. She just kind of cries and waits meekly for her knight in shining armor to come rescue her. That's not a very interesting character. So there's an element of truth to that. There are some games in which Zelda couldn't be a character because she was made of about 10 pixels. Link wasn't a character either. Neither of them were characters. They were very simple, pixelated things that you were supposed to play a game with. And there was the most general idea of a story without there being a real story there that you could connect with, really. You could connect with the fun of the gameplay, but they were games. On the other hand, I think that the problem for feminism, the problem for social justice, and why this has become such a heated topic recently is that they take their argument too far. So if on one hand you can understand that maybe it's not good to teach girls to only be quiet and submissive and to never try to solve their own problems. It's good to teach girls to take their problems into their own hands and try to solve some of their problems. But what they're essentially arguing is that if a character sacrifices himself, if a character undergoes enormous pain and difficulty on behalf of someone else, they must only be doing it for selfish reasons. They must only be doing it because he sees Zelda as his property, he has romantic interest in Zelda, and he wants to make Zelda his wife in a patriarchal system. And I think this is where the argument goes way too far. I've heard other people kind of articulate this basic idea, but this is reducing the characters. These are reducing characters that people really care about into a completely foreign world, a completely foreign concept. But it's almost cruel to do that to a character that people care about so much. Young boys and young girls can identify with a young male character as the hero because he has human problems, especially in these comics where they give him a little bit more personality than he has in the games. But you can identify with his problems and his struggles and his goals, whether you're a boy or a girl. And there are other comics I could talk about where I can perfectly well identify with a young female character who's also trying to help her friends, because I don't just need the character to be a white male for me to identify with them. I can identify with a girl, I can identify with a character of any race, so long as the writer intelligently gives them human emotions that you can see, that you can connect with, that you can see in your own family. The Legend of Zelda, both the video games and especially these manga, are not just stories about a young man trying to take his property. These are stories about a young man who cares about people. He cares about people who are like brothers and sisters to him, who are like fathers and mothers to him, who are his traveling companions. Maybe there's romantic interest there, but cop squad, but it's not necessarily about that. That's why I think in so many of the games they leave it open. They don't tell you that he marries Princess Zelda and lives happily ever after at the end. They leave it a little open about what happens to him after the game ends. And that, what I think I've expressed is my passion for this franchise and this character, but I don't think I've quite made clear yet how I'm connecting this to the problem with social justice and why I think this will never go away. If the problem social justice had with any comic book or every video game is, one little thing that you need to tweak, or there's one racist joke, or there's one transphobic joke, and if you just remove that one little thing, it would fix everything that's problematic about the book, and then progressives would love it. Well, that might be a little annoying to certain people who don't like seeing their work censored or changed at all, but if that was all it was, I think that social justice could have a lot more success in the culture. But the problem with social justice isn't that there's just one little thing that you got to tweak to fix this. The problem with social justice is that the heart of the story is problematic. There's no way to fix the heart of this story. Because it'd be like saying, I love Star Wars, but the thing about Star Wars is it needs a little less adventure. No adventure. If it's Star Wars, but what they need to do is they need to sit around and talk about the Empire and call themselves the Resistance and maybe talk about how bad the Empire is for building that wall, #Drumpf, I think that a lot of people would love to have metaphors for their political attitudes, but without any of the content that could be potentially problematic. And I think this creates some tension within the hearts of a lot of people who may be sympathetic to social justice, like me, who may be feminists, but they love these kind of stories and they connect with these kind of stories. And I think this ends up leading to young people having to talk about these stories and constantly be checking themselves, constantly be talking about the problematic elements, constantly be talking about, oh, wouldn't it be nice if it wasn't reinforcing patriarchy? Well, there's no way that this story can't reinforce patriarchy as it's been defined, at least as it seems to me to have been defined by mainstream feminist academics. The heart of the story of a young man helping a young girl is defined as patriarchal. The heart of this story is a young man helping a young woman and lots of innocent people, the entire world, essentially. So perennially, there's no way that the problem will go away. You can't, the social justice problem in comics and video games isn't a problem that can be solved by one side winning or making an argument or making content that's considered progressive today, because nothing will ever be progressive enough. You'll always have to keep reinventing it. You'll always have to keep changing it or tweaking it or taking out problematic elements, because the heart of the story that we're connecting with is young man grows up, helps people, fights bad guys. That's not something you can take out of the human soul and not make the human soul resonate with. It doesn't always have to be a young man doing that. I've read books that I think capture the heroic qualities that make comics beautiful and stories beautiful with a female protagonist. But what's always important is not the gender, but the heart of the characters and what they're trying to accomplish. So, good book. I recommend it. This has really been a long stream of consciousness video for me. So what I think I might do is, I think I'll make videos where I try to hone in a little bit on the point I'm trying to get at. Shout out in the comments if you think I talk way too much. If I talk way too much, tell me how I might be able to kind of focus a little bit more on what I'm trying to get at. But I think I've said everything I've wanted to say. So why am I doing this YouTube video? I've thought a long time about doing YouTube videos talking about comics and video games, and I've never been brave enough to jump in and just do it. And the reason why is I've always told myself if I was going to do it, I'd want to be focused and I want to do it carefully and do it right so that I could be proud of the work I made. So today might be an exception. Maybe it'd be fun for me to make a stream of consciousness video once in a while just to kind of express some of my thoughts and say it out loud as a way of maybe helping me to refine what I'm saying. I've noticed a lot of people I listen to, when they use YouTube, they're actually using it to think through things out loud by talking. And the comments become a way for people to talk to them, help them figure this out. So I'm sorry for this being so long. It's my first time and I tend to talk too long. What I would like to do in future is have videos where I focus on one little thing in a comic and maybe talk about the line work or talk about the composition and then show you how I think about comics to help me make better comics. I look for errors, I look for things that interrupt the flow of the story and take you out of the story, and I look for awesome things where they're subtly helping you become more engrossed in the world. I'd say I'm about 95% interested in art and about 5% interested in story. But what I love about the art is when the art serves the story and pulls you into the story, it's a beautiful whole. So shout out in the comments if you think I'm a goofball, hashtag notification squad. And once again, thank you to DNC, thank you to Douglas Ernst. You've really, watching your videos has helped me. And I just want to thank you now for making those. So peace. I'll catch you guys later. The manga generally is, I'd call it solid, but not groundbreaking, borrowing another term from my boy Zach. But they generally have, in the very early volumes, you'd see they had a very 90s style of drawing, very angular faces. And what I love about their drawing style is some of that, there's a consistency to their drawing style, but they're always reinventing themselves based on the game. So if it's a more kid-friendly game, they'll have a more chibi style. If it's a more mature game like this one, they will add more depth and realism to it. And I think this is probably their best work that I've seen, as much as I love the first 10. And that I tend to recommend those series to parents of kids. I work as an art tutor, so when parents ask me, well, what's a manga my kid could read? And I think, geez, so many of them have, like, I love them, but they're not necessarily good for 8-year-olds in some of their content. But the Zelda manga, the Pokemon manga, I have no problem recommending that to parents of really young kids. Should you read this if you are not a fan of the video games themselves? That's something I was thinking about a lot, because I love this game series, and if I try to strip my nostalgia from the game series away, does it still work as a manga, as a standalone comic? Yes, I think it does. And I think that's one of the real strengths of this team, is they clearly love this game franchise. They're clearly bringing a lot of ideas from the games into the world of their comic. But they are first and foremost making a comic that stands on its own 2 feet as a good comic. So there's really the only thing I think would be hard for you to understand if you're not a fan of the video games themselves, is that every version of the character is like separated by 100 years. So every Link is a different Link, every Princess Zelda is a different Zelda. That's really the only thing I think, if you weren't a fan of the video games, would be a little weird for you to understand, and I just explained it in a sentence. So you could enjoy this story because at its heart, this is a really old story.